Thank you, music team. Good morning, everyone, and happy Memorial Day. So I was listening to Joseph Campbell this week talking about mythology and how much of an impact mythology makes and has made on our lives throughout centuries, and how important it is for us in our spiritual journey. And he also talked about the reality that there comes a point in our lives where we have to move beyond mythology and to begin to experience life at its fullness. There's a point in all of the world's religions where myth and reality meet. And I think it is at that juncture that mythology's purpose is for us to be able to look out on the vast horizon of life and to be able to take all of that in and explore the horizon and then return that gaze back to the looker or back to ourselves. And the purpose behind that activity is to have us practice what Charles Fillmore calls the art of discernment and understand that we are much more than we think we are. Wherein we are fully human, we also possess what we think of as godlike qualities. And as I thought about that process can often, and it often does, create some confusion for us, because most of our lives, when we tend to look out, we see all the world's possibilities. But then when we turn back into ourselves, we begin to see the limits that we've learned, the limits that have been suggested to us, the limits that are placed upon us by many different institutions in our world, including religion. So many limits that in fact they can sometimes seem overwhelming to us. And we have to be able to flip the switch when that takes place. And we have to start looking at what we think are our shortcomings and then move beyond those. There are so many things that we can place on ourselves: not smart enough, not wise enough, not educated enough, not strong enough, not young enough, not pretty enough, not good enough. All of those things that we hear and things that we take on as a result of our experience. Those are some shortcomings that we can find ourselves being willing to give up if we believe that we can move beyond this mythology that has been placed upon us. Someone has said, if you allow the truth to take root in your consciousness, we as human beings will begin to see our greatness. And we will not only begin to see it, we will understand that greatness lies not so much in being able to remake the world outside of us, as much as it relies on our ability to remake ourselves, to create ourselves into the vision that we have for our lives. So this morning's message is about moving beyond myth. And one of the hardest things to do in life is to accept responsibility for our own shortcomings. It's also equally as hard to accept responsibility for our own well-being. Yet, when we're willing to do that, when we're willing to accept that responsibility, it's the most empowering thing that we can do in our lives, because it frees us to search for different perspectives in our lives. It frees us to see things in a new light, and it frees us to get greater understanding about the purpose of our existence on this planet. And it frees us to know the truth, that we are made in and after the image of God and all that God represents. So in his book, The Concentric Perspective, Eric Butterworth kind of delves extensively into this phenomenon of looking beyond the myth and tackling the mythology of words, which is what most of our spirituality has been based upon. It's words. Words in the scripture and what those words meant in the context of Jesus speaking them in his native language, and how we can understand them in the context of our own lives and the mythology that we've learned throughout our experience in Christianity. And the first words he talked about are from the Gospel of Matthew. They're found in the 5th chapter and the 5th verse. And the scripture reads, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now, Butterworth calls this piece of scripture the science of gentleness. He went on to say that there is sometimes a human tendency in all of us to use a battering ram rather than to use a key to open the doors that present themselves to us in our lives. And he's talking about doors figuratively, doors representing jobs, doors representing careers, doors representing money, doors representing getting ahead in life, doors representing getting a mate, doors representing whether we feel well about ourselves, doors representing obstacles, doors representing all the repercussions that come from our bad behaviors and so forth. Just name it. And the concentric perspective from which he's talking about these doors is based on the simple premise of getting out of our own way. And that sounds rather simplistic, doesn't it? How can we get out of our own way? Well, that happens to us, that many times we get in our own way. We get in our own way because we don't let the divine flow work itself through us. That may sound simple, but it's actually quite profound. Because wisdom and guidance and direction is being provided for us every moment of our lives. Everything we will ever need is in the Spirit within us. And quite often we impede that Spirit from feeding our souls and pushing us in the direction that we want to go in our lives because we're arrogant enough to stand in our own way and obstruct the divine flow. To make his point, Eric tells an interesting anecdote about the actor Gregory Peck, a well-known movie star who happened to be standing in line in a restaurant in New York City, and he was waiting on a table. And with him was a friend. And the friend had grown impatient with having to stand in line and waiting. So he leaned over and he whispered into Gregory Peck's ear, "Why don't you go up to the maitre d' and tell the maitre d' who you are?" And so Peck ignored him, and the friend continued to be impatient and shuffling and fiddling around. And he turned to Peck again and said the same thing. "Why don't you go to the maitre d' and tell them who you are?" And finally, Peck just looked at him and he said to him wisely, If you have to tell someone who you are, then you aren't. If you have to tell somebody who you are, then you aren't. And there's a lot of braggadocious behavior that takes place in our lives where we feel like we have to tell someone who we are instead of being patient and gentle and waiting. There was a similar story I remember about a young woman whose father was a judge. And often when she was asked what her name was, she would introduce herself as Judge Brown's daughter. And her mother heard her saying that at one point, and her mother, thinking that it might sound like it was a bit pretentious, suggested to the young girls that you should stop doing that and just say your name, which is Dorothy Brown. So later someone asked the young girl if she was Judge Brown's daughter, and she responded, well, I thought I was, but my mother says not. Blessed are the meek. The word for meek is praesis in the Greek language of Jesus. And it simply means to harness or to restrain oneself. And interestingly, the French translation of the Bible, where it talks about this same piece of scripture, says, blessed are the debonair. So you see, it doesn't have anything to do with weakness. In the French language, debonair means being courteous. It means being gracious. It means being charming. And it means taking away the thought that you have to stand up and be strong and forceful at all times in your life. Doesn't suggest that there's anything wrong with being strong and forceful and whatever else you need to do in the appropriate moment. But it suggests that there are times when you need to be restrained and gracious. Eric went on to say in the streets of New York at that particular time, debonair could also mean blessed are the cool. I like that. Blessed are the cool, because that's what they would say in my neighborhood. Blessed are they who have it all together. Now, on the surface, these definitions may seem simple, but they can make a world of difference. Because if you think about 100 years of people misinterpreting anything, you can see how it screws up the process of living. And religion is a very complex thing, because we not only are involved in putting our heart and soul into it, it's also there to provide a pathway for us to move forward in our lives and also to be at peace and to be able to enjoy the process of living. But if we get stuck on our misconceptions about what things mean, it can set up a lot of trouble in somebody's life, because you're living from your heart and trying to be who you believe you should be, but you're also holding these thoughts that have been implanted in your mind about how you should be who you are. And there's always that, what I would call, war going on within us that hampers our well-being and gets in the way of us being successful. It may seem unimportant, but it's very important that we move beyond that literalism and find ourselves to be who we truly are. There's a new book out by Brene Brown, and I forget the title of the book, but in that book, she makes about 10 interesting points. And they're about what she calls 10 guideposts for wholehearted living. Strategies that teach us to deal with the hard events and emotions of life. Anyone here ever had any hard events or hard emotional experiences in your life? And you'll understand what she's talking about. She says a wholehearted person is, in simple terms, an authentic person. A person who's come from something that they don't know anything about. They come from someone that they know little about. I come from that person who keeps it real. They don't worry about what other people think. They don't go along to get along. They're just true to themselves. That's a wholehearted person, she says. She said a wholehearted person also has compassion for themselves. They understand that perfection is an empty concept. How many of us have made a god of trying to be perfect? Because there's a line in Scripture that says, "Be ye perfect, as my Father in heaven is also perfect." But if we get stuck in our personal idea of what perfection is, how can we ever reach it? If we see Jesus in the light of what we deem him to be, or what he's been deemed to be by all the historians, then we don't have an experience of who Jesus truly was. And if you read the scriptures, it's quite clear who he was. He's a man who did not make judgments about any kind of people. He interacted with all levels of society. So he didn't have any of the biases and prejudices that have been projected onto religion. That's the true Christ. These are pretty hard truths. She also said a wholehearted person is resilient. They fess up and face up to the challenges in their lives. She said wholehearted people depend on their faith and on their intuition to rise above the increasing desire and drive for certainty. We all want certainty in our lives. We're going to be certain that we're going to wake up in the morning, certain that we're going to be able to go to work. We want to be certain that our cars are going to start, that our houses are going to be able to house us. But life has uncertainties. And so what do we do when those things aren't there? How do we stand in the truth of who we are? We have to be wholehearted people. And wholehearted people have to be able to see beyond the constraints that they're in. Wholehearted people practice gratitude. They dance in the truth of who they are. Wholehearted people rejoice in their own creativity. They don't get caught up in competing. They don't get caught up in comparing themselves to others or competing with others. Wholehearted people know how to balance work and play. Wholehearted people know how to be still, how to find calmness in the midst of madness. Wholehearted people know how to find their own meaning by giving themselves permission to find it. Everyone has equal access to the same God, but that access can be evasive if we're depending on somebody else to tell us how to get to it. Wholehearted people become a wholehearted person. I'm going to leave you with this thought from my favorite teacher, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says, and I quote, "Everything that Jesus taught was natural. It was not supernatural, but natural. Miracles do exist, but not as supernatural interventions. Jesus spoke of miracles because he felt that humanity's life and all that that life represented is a miracle. Jesus spoke of miracles knowing that just to be alive is the greatest gift that we can ever have. I don't know anything that I can add to that. This is about our lives, this journey that we're on. And it's important for us to be able to see clearly and to understand what we have to offer in this world and to be willing to be rewarded for it, to accept this gift of life that we've been given and use it to the highest and best that we possibly can. That's why we're here. It doesn't get any more complicated than that, and it doesn't get any simpler than that. God bless.
This message has been brought to you by Unity Church of San Antonio. To open your heart, transform your life, and celebrate your divine identity, visit us on the web at www.unityofsa.org. And remember, you are the light of God, so shine brightly today.